All right, welcome back to another episode of the Athenianos podcast, where each episode is a new ripple containing unknown but unlimited impact. Today's episode will be focused on euthanasia. And joining me is William Hamilton, who I'm sure you guys are familiar with by now. And
Hello, glad to be back for this special episode.
Yes, and Dr. Michael Cholbi, who deserves a little bit of an introduction for his vast and impressive resume. So just to list a few of your accomplishments. So you are a founding member of the International Association for the Death and Dying. Published 70 peer-reviewed articles, 3 books, including one entitled Suicide, The Philosophical Dimensions, which was named the Choice Outstanding Academic Title. Another book, which is your most recent, My Grief, A Philosophical Guide, which is the first book on the philosophy of grief. And you hold a chair position at the University of Edinburgh, where William and I have had the pleasure of having you as a lecturer. So thank you so much for being on. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We're honored.
Well, certainly, it's a very nice invitation.
Yeah. So, as mentioned, the topic is euthanasia today. So if that's a trigger warning for anybody, you've been warned. I don't know why it would be, but just in case. The structure of the episode is going to be in 3 parts, roughly. The first is going to be related to understanding the nature of euthanasia, what it is, terms, definitions. The second part is going to be focused more on the ethics of euthanasia. And then the third part, if we have time, to have a brief discussion on the philosophy of death and the importance of talking about it in a philosophical context. So I'll put timestamps in the description if you don't have time to listen to the whole thing and certain parts are more interesting, but that's the way it's going to go. So kicking off with the first section, I wanted to start kind of just giving definition of the terms, because there's a lot of types of euthanasia, and there's also some disparity between euthanasia, assisted suicide, and suicide, what you call run-of-the-mill suicide. So I was wondering if either of you could just give us a brief description or a brief delineation of the difference between voluntary euthanasia, assisted suicide, and run-of-the-mill suicide.
Well, as I see it, all of the phenomena that we're talking about here can be classified as suicide. In saying that, I am ruffling the feathers of a lot of activist groups that advocate for the legalization of assisted dying. Those groups generally tend to avoid the word suicide in discussing euthanasia and assisted dying. And they do so because the word suicide has a lot of negative connotations in people's minds. And so they're trying to dissociate their cause from a term that might lead people to be more skeptical of what they're advocating for. But I think if we understand suicide, as most philosophers and most legal theorists do, as intentional self-killing, then all of the phenomena that we're talking about here are suicide. So run-of-the-mill suicide, I take it, is intentional self-killing that is done essentially through your own resources. That is to say, you're not receiving help from anyone in ending your life. The traditional term euthanasia, of course, literally means sort of good death or good killing,
Right.
And was customarily used for many centuries to mean sort of any act of ending another person's life for their own benefit. Now, the way the terminology has developed, I think people now use euthanasia to refer to the act of causing another person's death for their own benefit or perceived benefit. And within that category, then, we have a kind of tripartite division. We can speak of involuntary euthanasia, that is to say, where a person is killed for their own benefit, but contrary to their consent, that is, they do not wish to die. Voluntary euthanasia, where the person is killed with their consent or in accordance with their wishes, and then non-voluntary euthanasia, which involves situations where the person's consent is not elicited or it can't be elicited. So, for example, a person who's in a long-term coma can't consent for or against, right? They're being euthanized. The term assisted suicide or assisted dying or assistance in dying has, on the other hand, taken to mean something like an act wherein a person assists you to die, but is not the sort of immediate cause, or their acts are not the immediate cause of your death. So assisted dying might encompass something like my giving a person information about how they might end their lives, or if I'm a doctor, writing a prescription for a drug that will enable them to end their lives, or giving them access to a technology, aware that the person will use it to end their lives. So there's a lot of terms that are in the air here. Again, I think all of them are in some sense, right, variations on a theme. They're all ways in which people, when they do so voluntarily at least, are aiming to hasten their own deaths, and hence they count as suicide. But much of the debate, I suppose, in the legal and policy realms has been about either assisted dying or voluntary euthanasia.
Mm. And I understand for euthanasia, you have an active and a passive form of euthanasia. Is that correct? Where the active is somebody is taking an active step to end your life, whereas passive euthanasia, you remove something that is keeping you alive.
Yes, though I think that those terms are a bit contentious in a certain sense. And I think that the way you describe them sort of illustrates how they are contentious. So passive euthanasia has come to designate something like a measure wherein a person acts so as an underlying medical condition that is leading to or is going to cause a person's death becomes operative. So, for example, if a individual is being sustained by an artificial ventilator, right, being provided artificial respiration, and they or their medical decision maker requests that ventilation be removed, and there's good reason to think that they will die relatively imminently, right, if that ventilation were to be removed, that would count as passive euthanasia. Likewise, the withdrawal of nutrition and hydration, right? Artificial nutrition and hydration can be viewed as an instance of passive euthanasia. But notice that in many cases, a person has to do something, right? So there's a way of calling it passive euthanasia is perhaps slightly misleading, because someone has to do something, right, to make it the case that your death will happen earlier than it otherwise would be. So you'll note that I tried to underscore there that when we talk about passive euthanasia, what we're really talking about is that the individual, right, who is intervening in the situation does not cause your death by introducing a new causal factor. So, for example, they don't inject you with a lethal medication. Rather, they remove, right, some sort of feature of your care that is sustaining your life. And by removing that,
right,
your death will presumably be hastened.
Well, so one question I had about this is because the distinction I agree is a little bit tricky, and in, let's say, in a case when somebody is suffering from a terminally ill disease, or even they're being kept alive by a defibrillator, and some machine is keeping them alive just barely. Why would there be a difference between injecting them with the lethal dose of morphine and removing the machine that is keeping them alive? Because wouldn't the injecting them with the lethal dose of morphine constitute active, but the removing the machine that's keeping them alive is considered passive? But in reality, they're both choices that are ending their lives.
Well, and if they're done voluntarily, right, that is to say that the patient provides voluntary consent to those measures, then you might think, indeed some philosophers have thought, James Rachel's being, I guess, the most famous example, that there really isn't a difference, a moral difference, right, between these two things. Now, clearly there's some, I guess we could say, metaphysical difference, right? If you were to ask in the case of typical instances of what we've been calling passive euthanasia, and again, I find that term somewhat misleading because, again, it usually requires someone to do something, to act. But in the cases of passive euthanasia that we've been discussing, it'd be natural to say that what causes the person's death is the underlying cancer, organ failure, whatever that brought them into that state in the first place. Whereas, right, injecting someone with a powerful, a lethal sedative, you might say that the cause of death has shifted from the underlying medical condition to this new factor, right, that's on the scene, right, the injection of a lethal drug. I think the significance of this is, the moral significance of this has to do with the traditional precept of medical ethics that doctors in particular are not to kill their patients or contribute to the killing of their patients. And many people throughout time have argued that doctors may permissibly participate in what we've been calling passive euthanasia because they don't kill their patients thereby. Right. Whereas they may not participate in active euthanasia because in that instance it would be the doctor killing or contributing to the killing. But I agree that the active passive language, I think, sometimes introduces more confusion than clarity here.
Right.
Yeah, so couldn't you say in the cases of passive euthanasia, you were suggesting that you'd say the cause of the death would be the cancer, the underlying disease. But couldn't you just as easily say that the cause of the death is the doctors removing the treatment for the cancer ultimately?
Well, I think it's tricky. And that's one of the classic criticisms, a criticism that I'm sympathetic to, by the way, that the active-passive contrast doesn't hold a lot of water. I think one way to see this is, to ask yourself, well, if we're talking about the difference between roughly killing and letting die, that's sort of how people sometimes couch it. It seems strange to think that if a doctor were to remove a ventilator that's keeping a person alive, and in so doing, they knowingly hasten the patient's death. Right? It'd be strange to say that they're not killing the patient. Whereas I think we would all agree that if I broke into a hospital and found my enemy in the ICU and I removed his ventilator, I would say that I killed my enemy. Right? So it seems a little bit odd to think that who you are, right, could have any bearing on whether or not your death is the consequence of my killing you or my letting you die, consequence of an action or the consequence of something passive on my part. That's a very familiar problem or criticism with that basic distinction, even as a matter of, if you will, kind of metaphysics.
I guess.
Yeah, I've actually heard of this distinction before. The times I've heard it more is more in the context of utilitarianism and deontology, where from, correct me again if I'm wrong in any of these sections, but utilitarians are more predisposed to not allowing a distinction between killing and letting die, whereas it's a bit more important to keep that for deontologists. Obviously, you're a Kantian ethicist yourself, so I would like to see your opinion on this.
I have some Kantian sympathies. I'm not an orthodox Kantian, but
Okay.
It is certainly true that utilitarians, because they're consequentialists, are not likely to put much stock in the distinction between killing and letting die, active, passive euthanasia. Consequentialist thinks that, whether we're acting rightfully or not depends upon the consequences of what we do. And, if the consequence of what someone does to bring about a person's death is essentially the same, whether active, passive, whether killing or letting die, well, the utilitarian is going to say that's, a distinction we perhaps can make, but it's not a distinction that bears any moral weight. You're right to say that many deontologists are likely to be more sympathetic to this line of thought, insofar as if you are a deontologist, kind of rule-based ethicist, you might think that there's a very important moral rule here at stake. Again, something like, we ought not kill, or doctors ought not kill their patients. And so some of the actions we've been describing would violate that rule, whereas one might think, right, that passive euthanasia doesn't amount, right, to killing someone. It amounts to permitting their deaths.
Yeah, I guess one question I had is, because I do think just intuitively there is a moral difference between, let's say, euthanizing somebody that is, I don't know, 100 years old, is sitting on their deathbed, and is or a deer that's not a deer, but a person that's been shot and wounded, and if they don't provide the necessary treatment, they're going to die in a minute. If they give treatment, maybe they'll die in a week.
Mhm.
I do see that there's a difference between that where somebody is very close to death, or they are trending towards death in a very immediate sense, versus somebody who's a 25-year-old, 35-year-old adult in perfect health, and is voluntarily asking for their death. But I still think that intuitively most people would agree there is a difference um, between euthanizing somebody that is on the doorstep of death and somebody who has a long ways away. And I guess maybe that's part of what the passive and active distinction was trying to do. But is there a better way to account for that distinction, or maybe that distinction is not relevant morally?
Well, I mean, I think that, again, many theologians, medical ethicists, some philosophers have put a lot of weight on this difference between killing and letting die. Right? They not only think it's a viable distinction, as a matter of fact, they think it's a morally important distinction. Right? And indeed, I would say that the prevailing legal frameworks in many parts of the world, not all, but many parts of the world, are such that if a patient asks a doctor to remove, right, some technology, say that's sustaining their life, the doctor is obligated to do that, right? That the patient's rights as a patient, say that they're not to be subject to medical interventions that they don't wish to receive. But at the same time, right, in many of those same jurisdictions, they're not entitled to seek assistance from their doctor or maybe from anyone, right, to hasten their death via active means. Now, the question of sort of who, right, should have access to assisted dying, if anyone should, is, I suppose, one of the key legal and policy questions about assisted dying that people have been discussing in recent decades. The example that you gave of someone, a very aged person, very near death, versus someone, I suppose we could say, in the prime of their lives, who's requesting euthanasia. I think that the relevance there philosophically has to do with the degree of risk or the degree of harm at stake. So, if someone really is quite close to, if you will, a natural death, right, and has lived 80, 90, 100 years, you might think that if we assist them to die, they're not likely to lose out on much, right? They're likely to die within weeks, months, etc. The quality of life that they're likely to lose out on may not be particularly high. So losing out on, 2 months, right, of very low quality of life, you might think that I should have a right to prevent, right, my having to live any further. But the person is in their prime of their life, 30-year-old person. They might be facing a lot of adversity. They might be enmeshed in a great deal of suffering, but you might think, well, there's a good deal more risk there, because if they survive all of this, they could live many decades more, and they could potentially have a great deal of good life to look forward to. So I think that, basically what's at stake there, or what that illuminates, is that, in order to think about the justifiability of euthanasia or assisted dying, we need to think about the degree to which a person is harmed or benefited, right, by having their death hastened under different circumstances or at different points in their lives.
Yeah, I guess this does bring me to a question which I was going to ask at some point, which is regarding consent ethics with euthanasia. So a lot of kind of the layman discussions on euthanasia focuses a lot on consent, but as you kind of were hinting at, consent may only be sort of indicative of the harm that will come afterwards. So would you say that consent for euthanasia is kind of intrinsically necessary, or it's only necessary because it's indicative of the harm that will come from it? If somebody consents to dying, then obviously it's more likely than not that it will be it'll be beneficial.
Right. It's a very good question. There are very few, right, defenders of involuntary or non-voluntary euthanasia or assisted dying among philosophers, legal theorists, and so forth. There are some who defend it for certain quite particular populations. Some defend it for neonates that have very, very bad lives to look forward to, but they're just not in a position to understand their situation and consent or not. Newborns, but overwhelmingly, right? Those who support the legalization of assisted dying and euthanasia do think that it should be provided people only with their consent. Now, I think what your question raises is what are the philosophical underpinnings of that? I guess it seems to me that there are kind of two ways of looking at this. On the one hand, going back again to the question of harm and benefit, you might think that the importance of consent is, if you will, epistemic, right? That if the question is whether hastening a person's death is beneficial or harmful to them, you might think that the person who would know this best or is best situated to judge that matter is the person themselves, right? They have a kind of knowledge or understanding of their own situation and the suffering they're facing and their ability to withstand that suffering, etc. That makes them, if you will, kind of privileged, right, in making this decision. Yeah. So they understand the stakes better. That would be one way to justify the importance of consent in this conversation. The other way, I suppose, would be to say, to appeal not so much to people's prudence or knowledge or understanding of their own suffering and their own situation, but simply to say that with respect to important life decisions, people should have a right to make them on their own, irrespective of how wise or prudent they might be in making those decisions, right? So, you might think that assisted dying is among the things that people should have a right to decide for themselves, somewhat akin to the basis of having the right to decide, whether and whom to marry, or what profession to practice, or what religion to pursue, right? With these sort of crucial life-defining decisions, we tend to think that people should have a lot of, authority over them, right? That we should defer, right, to them because they really matter to them above all else. So I think those are kind of two ways you might approach the justification or importance of consent. Either, the individual knows better, or they simply have a kind of authority over their lives that they're entitled to exercise.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I'm actually surprised to hear that that euthanasia in non-voluntary cases is very unpopular. I guess most of my knowledge from the discourse comes from Peter Singer, so you could see maybe my perspective is a little bit slanted.
Well, Singer is, of course, someone who has advocated for non-voluntary euthanasia, for neonates who have very, severe disabling kinds of illness. And that's, I suppose, one of the truly harrowing, troubling kinds of cases, regarding assisted dying and euthanasia. So, yeah, but there are not too many, by and large, I don't think there's all that many advocates of legalization of assisted dying who begin their case by advocating for non-voluntary cases. The status quo throughout much of the world has been that you just don't have a right to assisted dying or euthanasia, even if you do so and you're doing so competently, voluntarily as an adult, right? And so much of the conversation has really been on that kind of paradigmatic kind of situation.
Yeah, because it's framed quite differently. I think Peter Singer frames the issue quite differently. The way you're framing it, and certainly makes sense in this context, is through the lens of suicide. But from what I remember of Singer, the main way he frames it is from killing and when it's okay to kill someone, and then he moves on from there.
Right. And of course, the case of non-voluntary euthanasia, interestingly enough, I suppose I'm walking back a little bit what I said earlier. You can in some sense classify non-voluntary euthanasia as really not suicide at all, because of course the person is not really engaged in self-killing, right? They're being killed in the absence of their own consent, either for or against it. But that's you're correct that he sort of starts the conversation with the question, viewing this as a question about the ethics of killing. And I think both my approach and his have sort of merit in illuminating the underlying issues.
Yeah, that's for sure.
I wanted to kind of come back to the issue you raised of well-being recently, because when we were talking about the difference of the adult who's in, let's say the prime of his life, and the elderly person who's on the footstep of death, that's very much talking about well-being in terms of a physical context. And I wondered if you see it, if there's a difference between physical well-being and psychological well-being in terms of justifications of euthanasia, in terms of consent. So the person who is asking to be euthanized, if there's a difference between the justification they give being a physical a claim about their physical well-being, or a claim about their psychological well-being.
So I think there are two dimensions to your question. So one dimension is whether we should think that however strong or weak the case is for permitting assisted dying or euthanasia, does the case become stronger or weaker depending upon whether the suffering is sort of physiological bodily suffering or whether it's mental. And my own opinion on that is no, right? That we shouldn't think that one sort of suffering is more significant, more serious, more weighty than another. Indeed, I think there has long been, and still is in many quarters, a kind of bias against the idea that sort of suffering that can't be associated with physiological illness is thereby, fictitious or not weighty or not substantial. I think when you actually look at, the places where assisted dying has been legal for some time, and you look at the studies that have been conducted of people who seek out assisted dying, a lot of their reasons for seeking it out are only incidentally connected, if you will, with physiological or bodily suffering. Yes, many of them do mention pain, but in many cases, that they desire assistance in dying, even though their physical pain is reasonably well managed. What they seem to actually be suffering from is a sense that their medical condition bars them from participating in the things that make their life worthwhile or meaningful. Right? Mm. It's not so much that, it's unfortunate that you are undergoing physical pain and these other sorts of things, but rather that, in many persons who have advanced, illnesses, they're not able to, enjoy their lives, not able to participate in the things that are sources of meaning and well-being to them. So as I see it, we shouldn't think that one of these forms of suffering is, more weighty or more substantial or provides a stronger case, right, for permitting assisted dying or euthanasia. The other dimension of your question, I suppose, has to do with the question of the validity of consent, right? So generally speaking, most people who defend the permissibility of euthanasia or assisted dying under some circumstances will say that people should only receive this if they've consented, and the consent needs to be informed, or they need to be competent, right? Or they need to have the right kind of capacity, right, to make this kind of decision for themselves. And I suppose there, the question of mental suffering, and in particular, maybe certain kinds of mental illnesses comes into play, right? We might wonder whether certain kinds of mental disorders that people have could impede, right, their ability to provide valid, informed consent, right? So to take an example that I think is a fairly strong one. So, the condition of depression is one where many people suffer, I would say, from a certain kind of irrationality in some cases, right? They are very focused on their current suffering. They're very focused on the pain and difficulty that they're experiencing in the moment. They discount the future, and they have a very sort of unduly pessimistic view of the future. They don't have difficulty imagining that their futures could get better. And that's a case where you might sort of say, well, maybe we should be concerned, right, about a person receiving assisted dying or euthanasia for that condition, precisely because maybe their condition precludes them, right, from really having a full grasp of what it is they're opting for, as well as sort of the advantages and disadvantages of alternatives. So I think your question has those two dimensions.
Yeah. So with run-of-the-mill suicide, there's I was thinking there's often you hear in many cases where people choose to commit suicide from depression, as you were saying, is a major one that they will regret it as soon as they're trying it. I was just wondering, out of curiosity, since you might know this, does that ever happen with cases of assisted dying, where it's done through the proper procedures, and maybe a whole death date is set up, and then people arrive there, and then they just chicken out, I guess?
I'm not sure about the frequency of what you're calling chickening out. One thing that is very clear is, in places that follow the protocol that was made familiar in Oregon, right, with the Death with Dignity Act, it's pretty common for terminally ill people to receive prescriptions for a lethal medication and either not fill the prescriptions, that is to say, they never actually get the medication, or to get the medication and then end up not using it. I think the last number I saw is that happens something like about 40% of the time in a state like Oregon.
Okay. Yeah, that's decently high.
So I think what that tells us is something about what it is that people who seek assisted dying are seeking. They may not necessarily end up deciding that this is how they want to die, but they want to have the option. They want to have it available to them, right? If they think, if their condition deteriorates to the point where they don't feel they can withstand it any further, they want to have the medication available to them to administer if they so decide. And I think that speaks very deeply to one of the things that I think is a source of a lot of people's distress and anxiety surrounding dying, and in particular how people die in the modern world. Dying takes a very long time. It often is, a process that unfolds over weeks, months, years, etc. And people often feel out of control, right? And they feel kind of, beholden, right, to the condition that's sort of slowly killing them. And so I think that, what that tells us is that one thing that model, in particular of assisted dying, can do is it can give people back a measure of control in a situation, right, that very often for them feels or can feel very helpless.
So I guess just having the option maybe even just improves their lives because they regain a sense of control, and then they can kind of even choose to not die just because the sense of control has given them more clarity, I guess, in life.
Perhaps, or, it could just be that, in some cases that this could just involve miscalculation. It could be that, they get the medication and are planning to do this in a month's time, but their underlying illness, ends their lives in 2 weeks' time or something like that. But what seems to be clear is that for many people, right, there's a lot of reassurance or security to be had, right, in having access to this technology, that they can use in their lives, even if they ultimately end up deciding not to use it.
That's quite an interesting, phenomena to me, that people would take the option and then being unsure about whether or not they're going to use it. And this kind of relates a little bit into the motives of why somebody would choose to, commit suicide, get euthanized, or take the assisted suicide. Because as I see it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I see it that the number one reason, I guess, that somebody would choose this is that they judge that their life is no longer worth living. That the overall worth of their life is not worth continuing. And to me, that seems like a judgment that once you come to the conclusion that your life is no longer worth living, it would seem very difficult in my perspective, and almost it would seem like it'd be rare that once you reach that conclusion that your life is no longer worth living, to then I don't know, convince yourself that you do have life worth living, or that, I mean, it's just a question, but what's the reasoning in that you think is that you would have the option, but then decide not to do it if you've already judged that your life is not worth living?
Well, so I think that you are correct in what you're saying, though I would tweak the language ever so slightly, because of course everyone always exists in the present, right? And so I think that ultimately these are judgments less about the present quality of one's life than about one's expected quality of life, right? So a good many people, who've been interviewed, prior to taking advantage of assisted dying, in whatever parts of the world they happen to be, do not so much say that their present quality of life is especially bad. It's not very good, maybe, but it's not so much what they're in the moment, but rather that they're worried or frightened by a decline in quality of life that they would find intolerable. And there's something a little bit, paradoxical may overstate it, but there's a tension there insofar as what many people seem to want is to be able to hasten their own deaths in advance of a quality of life that they would think would be particularly bad, and during which they might not be able to make this decision. Right? So, if what I'm looking forward to, according to my doctors, is the progression of a cancer where, I might be subject to so much pain medication that, I'll be conscious for, only a minute or two here and there throughout the day, and I will be bedridden and unable to communicate, et cetera, et cetera. Many people say, I don't want that to happen to me. Right? Notice the emphasis on happen to me, not
right.
What is happening to me. Right? So I think oftentimes the reasoning is prospective.
Right.
Now, as far as people's reaching the judgment that they don't wish to continue their lives, or their lives aren't worth continuing in their eyes, well, I do think that's probably at the heart of people's thinking here, but it's worth keeping in mind other elements that are probably in play in their thinking too. One is fear of death. I've taught philosophy of death and dying for quite some time, and I think it's pretty common, right, that people have a fear or anxiety about death. And it may be that, when it comes right down to it, that fear, carries the day, right? Mm-hmm. Even though their lives seem very bad or seem to them likely to get far worse, they're still too afraid of death, right, to actually do it. In other cases, the interests and needs of others might play a role, right? They may feel that, they need to stay alive because, people who care about them want to stay alive, or there's certain, business they need to attend to, or something like that before dying. Mm. So, I think there's a number of things that can kind of lead people to hesitate, right? Even though they may be fairly well convinced, as you were saying, that their lives are not worth continuing.
And just if I could ask a follow up on the first part of your answer. So it's not so much a Camus-esque question about your life in total having meaning. It's more about the future, and whether the future has sufficient meaning, or is it so much that you judge that the future will no longer have meaning, like full stop, or is it that it doesn't have, you judge that the future won't have sufficient meaning for you to continue living?
I think it's the latter. I don't think you have to think that your future is meaningless. You simply have to think that whatever meaning could accrue to you from your future isn't worth whatever detriments to your quality of life continuing to live would bring. I would add just the one qualification that while I think that the question at hand is best thought of as a question about continuing to live, notice that sometimes, facts in the past can bear upon, whether you want to continue to live, right? So, many people who receive diagnosis of terminal illnesses, they'll set goals for how long they hope to live. Very often those goals will have to do with, things from the past. I want to live to see, I want to live to my next wedding anniversary, right? Or I want to live to see, such and such graduate from university, or something like that, right? And notice that those are the kinds of things that, though the events are in the future, their significance has a great deal to do with the person's history, right? The things they have done in their lives, right? And the projects and concerns that have been important to them up to that point, right? So, as with all decisions, right, sometimes the future matters to us, or it matters in particular ways, only because or thanks to things that have already happened in our lives.
And would you? So I'm assuming that this decision that somebody would make to say that their future won't have sufficient meaning. It's fundamentally a psychological decision. It may be right. It may be based on physical things, but fundamentally, would you say that it's in it's a psychological decision about your state of well-being going forward?
I suppose. I mean, I think that sometimes, right, I hear people say something like, that suicide or assisted dying, that people say things like, well, that's choosing to die. And, I always have to remind people that strictly speaking, it's not up to us whether we die, right? We are mortal creatures, right?
Right.
So, calling it choosing to die is in some sense slightly misleading, right? What we're really choosing is the timing.
Right.
Right. And what it is to kill a person, or what it is to engage in suicide, is to make it the case that that event, death, happens earlier than it otherwise would have happened. Right. And again, I think that the best way to think about this, and I think this is the way the most reasonable people who seek out assisted dying are thinking about this, is to ask, is my life worth continuing? Right? Is there something about it that I can look forward to in prospect, right? That makes me think, yes, I want to be here, in a week's time, a month's time, a year's time.
And what about the duty to die argument? Like, you feel that your life has too much of a burden on the people around you, that you feel an obligation to end your life to improve the well-being of the people around you. How would you fit that argument into previous discussions about personal well-being?
Well, I think most of the conversations that take place, around at least the legalization of assisted dying and euthanasia, focus on what we might think of as self-regarding factors, right? Self-regarding reasons, right? How is my life going, right? Or how will it go? But I think there's space for, and I think it would be good for there to be more space in the wider discussion for talking about the significance that one's continuing to live or one's not continuing to live might have on the well-being of others. And I'm going to say two things that might seem to be at odds with one another, but I hope they're really not. So the first thing is that I find it strange. I've often found it very strange that virtues that we tend to think, well, really are virtues, right? Really are laudable. Generosity, altruism, etc., concern for others, beneficence. Suddenly, many people think that we shouldn't act on those motives as our lives come to an end. Right? And the thought that one might be benefiting others by hastening one's death, by, for example, relieving other people of burdens of care or relieving them of emotional stress. I find it very strange that many people think that that is somehow a morally objectionable mindset, right? That seems to me very strange to think that, ordinarily we think that such altruism or generosity is laudable. So why is it that at the end of life we sort of think, oh, a person shouldn't have the right or shouldn't think that they have the right to hasten their deaths because of the impact that they're continuing to live and have on other people. So I think that should be given more respect, I suppose, right, in the broader discussion. That said, in suggesting that, sympathy maybe for the thought that people could have a duty to die, I'd be extremely apprehensive about turning this into something like enforceable duty.
Right.
I'd be extremely apprehensive about the thought that we should, operate our medical institutions, et cetera, in such a way that, we say to people, look, your continuing to live is just too costly or burdensome or difficult for other people. So, get ready. I don't think those are contradictory ideas, but it's important to sort of keep them apart, right? Sort of whether there conceivably be powerful reasons of altruism, beneficence, whatever, to want to hasten one's death. I think that the answer to that question is sometimes yes. And then the question of whether we should sort of treat that as a prerogative, right, of interpersonal social morality, there I'm much more hesitant.
And so what, in the first part of what you said, what acts would you say of virtue correspond to the duty to die? Like, would you say jumping on a grenade to save the other soldiers?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're kind of talking about, that we consider a virtue if you sacrifice your life to save others, to protect or increase their well-being?
I do find it remarkable, right, that, this kind of example you're talking about, not only do people laud it, we give people posthumous medals for that, right? Mm-hmm. And, we think of these people as heroic. Now, in the context of, say, someone with an advanced, cancer or other kind of terminal illness, well, it's not that they're not burdensome to other people, right? I think almost everyone agrees that there are burdens here. And I would also agree that societies and individuals have some duties to bear those burdens, right? To give people medical treatment and so forth. But I also think we should at least have a discussion about whether people should have the right to use their death, right, in ways that are beneficial to others. And we might even turn this back or spin this back into something we were talking about earlier, the notion of death or dying as an experience that feels hopeless or meaningless, right? I think what some people can find, or one thing that some people can find meaning in toward the end of life is, doing things like, as I say, getting their affairs in order, right? Who's going to, be the inheritor of their property and, that sort of thing, right? That's a way of turning one's dying into a meaningful event, right? But, when I think about a person who, for example, says, look, I have all of, these healthy donor organs, yes, one of my organs is going to fail, and that's why I'm going to die, but I have all these other healthy organs. And I'd like to hasten my death in order to ensure that as many of those organs as possible, right, can be donated to others and improve and extend their quality. I have to say, I find the idea that we should object to that somewhat difficult to swallow.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems to me to be generous, laudable, altruistic, right? But I think we do have this kind of funny mindset that at the end of life, selfishness is not only permitted, it's kind of mandatory.
Yeah.
I think a pretty big change from how we think about, morality across the rest of our lifespans.
That's a very good point. I guess the only counter argument I could think of is if somebody said, well, if you kind of lauded killing yourself in this same way and legalized it, I guess this is falling into like the slippery slope argument. Like, then maybe I don't know, people start to do it. People think, who are in their 60s and 50s who are fine, but think, I'm going to kill myself for the benefit of others, and that kind of spreads to a larger range of society, and more people engage in these acts. And maybe there's this is kind of an empirical question, and maybe there's data on the from countries and states that have legalized euthanasia on this subject.
Well, to my knowledge, there's nowhere in the world where you're legally permitted to hasten your death for the purpose, using the example we were using a moment ago, of providing viable donor organs. Okay. This isn't to say, right, that sometimes, medical personnel and families think about these things, right? As they think about care decisions and the deterioration of the body, right, and so forth. And so I don't think we have at our fingertips anything like empirical data that would allow us to know, what would happen. Nobody's really tried it. That said, right, I would just be in favor of a more candid, right, conversation about this particular aspect of end of life. Because it does seem to me that, again, people often frown upon, right, the idea that, you might want to hasten your own death because you're burdensome to other people in some way, or because you think you can benefit them in some way. But I don't see a very strong philosophical argument that those kinds of considerations should just be ruled out of bounds, right? That we just shouldn't even talk about.
Yeah.
We can talk about, when we should permit people to do it and when not. But, the thought that, again, at the end of life, the only thing that matters is you, the dying person.
Being self.
It seems to me is a very distressing and misguided ethical mindset.
So yeah, the way you framed it actually was very, very well put, and the way you put it as well makes you kind of think. It's quite stark, this disparity of how we treat death in these cases. And so why do you think there is such a disparity in terms of common thinking, common intuition? I know Peter Singer, for instance, talks a lot about sanctity of life, and that comes from like Christian worldview, which kind of prohibits this. But I mean, even under a Christian worldview, there is going to be this prejudice against this disparity of treating death differently in the two different cases.
It's a complicated question, and any answer I think I would not give with a lot of confidence, but I guess this is what I would say. I do think that the end of life, right, the end of my life, the end of your life, is of course an event that happens to us, but it's also an event that happens to other people. And I think that certain kinds of ethical imperatives tend to float to the surface, right, when people are near the end of life. And in particular, I think many, besides the dying, view it as their chance to show that they love or care for the dying person, that they're important or valuable or worthwhile. And there's a kind of insistence, right, that the person should, receive, as much care, attention, concern, et cetera, as we could possibly give them, to the point where anything that they might do that would involve foregoing that care, right, for what look like altruistic reasons, is thereby sort of viewed as spurning, right, the care or concern of others, right. It can be hurtful, right, to feel like your concern or love for a person is being spurned, right. And I suppose that's kind of how it feels to some people, right. If I were to say to my loved ones, well, I think I'm really becoming a very burdensome and difficult problem in your life, and I think I'm going to try to end my life, right, rather than make those burdens, impose those burdens on you. They might well say, this is our chance to show you how much you matter to us. We'll go to these great lengths, right, to care for you and make your life worthwhile. And that's a laudable, right? Like I want to praise and honor that instinct.
Yeah, that's nice.
Every time, notice that there is a kind of clash, perhaps, between the dying, or there can be a clash between the perspective of the dying person and the perspective of those who care about the dying person, including their medical care.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's not always necessarily the case. Sometimes the dying person might already know that kind of affection and the willingness to help someone so deeply, already exists. So I suppose it's just not always necessary. Yeah,
and I think, I've had more than a few physicians tell me that a lot of what happens at the end of some people's lives is a kind of contest, I suppose, right, to see who cares about the dying person the most. Right? Who will do the most? Who will show?
I can picture that actually very vividly.
Who will show just how important this person was, right? And then, I guess then the mindset creeps in. Well, who are you, the dying person, to prevent them from showing how much they care, showing what burdens they're willing to bear?
They're spoiling the competition.
Yeah. And I mean, you don't want to be, or I don't want to be, harsh or dismissive in this context, because I think, again, those are both praiseworthy instincts,
Yeah.
right? But I do think we should be more sympathetic to the thought that for some dying people, being able to die without causing others so much burden, in fact, perhaps even helping or aiding others, could be very important to them as they die, right? Again, it counteracts that sense of helplessness, perhaps, right? That lack of agency over your situation.
Mm. I wanted to ask a little bit of more specifically about kind of the arguments for legalization, for widespread legalization of euthanasia, because I know this is something that you have advocated for and have said that if we don't make euthanasia legal, illegal euthanasias will happen anyway. But I guess the counter to that would be if euthanasia is widespread and then it, number one, lends this kind of normative stance on euthanasia, that it's a good thing, or at least it could be interpreted as a normative position, and two, that the legalization of euthanasia would increase it among civilian populations immensely. So is there any empirical data on either of these, or I guess the latter part of this, in countries and states that do have legal euthanasia?
Well, let me come to the empirical question in a moment, but beginning with what you said at the outset of your question. But I do think it is important, right, in thinking about the question of legalization of assisted dying and euthanasia, to recognize that it occurs almost everywhere in the world, right? Everywhere that anyone has ever bothered to study, physicians and other medical personnel admit, typically in anonymous studies or anonymous surveys, that they have contributed, right, to what we would consider euthanasia or assisted dying. So I always want to advise people that the policy question, the legal question that is on the table is not no assisted dying or euthanasia versus legalized assisted dying or euthanasia, but rather some unlawful, in the shadows, black market, if you will, euthanasia or assisted dying, versus some, I'm not saying more or less, you'll notice, but some lawful assisted dying or euthanasia, open to public view, open to regulation, open to the powerful disinfectant that is sunshine. Okay. But I think that's a crucial point, right? Because I think even if you have hesitations or reservations about the legalization of assisted dying, you might think that it's still better to have it conducted in the open, however rarely, right? Than have it be, the sort of thing that, Dr. Kevorkian was doing in the 1990s. Okay. And I think, to me, that's a pretty powerful argument. I mean, I think people who are in very bad straits, right, and don't feel they have a lot to look forward to in their lives, can become desperate, right? And they will do things that, skirt or outright violate the law, right, in order to get what they view as a good death for themselves. I mean, consider the number of people who travel, right, to Switzerland, take advantage of the services of Dignitas, right? Often putting up a pretty significant amount of money, right, to do this. Typically, those people are coming from parts of the world where assisted dying isn't legal, right? So that, I think, speaks to this, I would say almost irrepressible, right, kind of motive. Now, as to whether or not, it increases the number of euthanasias or not, it's very hard to know, because it's very hard to know how much was going on in the absence of legalized euthanasia, right? So, I'm not sure that anybody is in a very good position to make confident claims about whether legalization increases, right, the frequency of assisted dying and euthanasia or not. But I would also say that I think that there are elements of the reasoning that you just described a moment ago that I just think are not very convincing, right? So very often, I will have people say, well, if we legalize this, then lots of people will take advantage of it, right? And I'm afraid I have to sort of give them a blank stare, right? Like, and so what, right? I mean, why is that a problem, right? Like, tell me why I should be fazed or upset by it, right? If I'm an advocate for the legalization of assisted dying, what would upset me more is if we legalized and nobody took advantage of it, right? Because then I would have made this terrible miscalculation that, this is something that people in the world want for themselves or would want for themselves, and I was wrong, right? But you very often do hear, I would say, I don't want to say alarmist, that may itself, using that word may be itself alarmist, but, sort of claims made, well, the percentage of people dying in, this country or this place due to, legalized assisted dying is X percent, 2%, 4%, 7%, whatever it is. And I always want to say, okay, but tell me why that's a problem, right? That seems to me to speak to the wisdom of the law, right? If lots of people want this and think that this is the best way for their lives to come to their conclusions, why isn't that an argument in favor of legalization, right? And I always want to know, what would be the number past which I should be worried? 10%? I don't know, right? Like,
right.
It seems like my opponents have some number in mind, but I don't know what that is. I think that what we're seeing, places like Australia in particular, I think illustrate this very powerfully, is that once this option is available to people, many people do think it's the best way to bring their lives to a close.
Yeah, I mean, I think I get the response from people who are already very morally against euthanasia. I mean, the argument you gave sounds incredibly similar to arguments that you would give just for fairly practical reasons to legalize abortion as well. And, you would get the same response on that end. And the thing is, regardless of the strength of that argument, do you think that it is very convincing to anyone who is and just staunchly against, just on a purely moral principle against euthanasia or against abortion in either case's work, I suppose?
Well, I mean, I never want to speak for those who stand on the other side of an issue, right? I think they should speak for themselves. I often find arguments like that one, and there are other arguments that are commonly advanced in these debates that just strike me as quite unconvincing and seem to me to rest on unstated premises, which once the premises are stated, it's hard to see why we should be convinced by them. I would say that I suspect, right, that probably some people who are skeptical about assisted dying in general might be willing to make an argument along the lines of, well, maybe this would be okay if, we legalized it and, once in a blue moon, somebody would take advantage of this, but it wouldn't be okay, or you shouldn't think it's okay if lots of people were to take advantage of it, thousands of people a year in, Canada and several thousand a year in the United States and whatever. But it's hard for me to see how, again, that should strike us as a particularly strong or compelling argument, right? It might be a compelling argument if, the individual could point to evidence suggesting that a large number of those who take advantage of these laws have been exploited, or the law wasn't applied correctly and they weren't competent, or they didn't really meet the conditions to be eligible, right, for assisted dying wherever they happen to live. That's usually not the argument that people make, right? It's that, a bunch of people will meet the eligibility conditions and the law will operate, and then, we'll have 5% of people opting for assisted dying. And I always say, why should that trouble us? So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just already if you think that assisted dying is bad, I guess suicide in general is bad, and the argument is specifically for the practicality of it. You're saying like practically it would lower the amount of assisted suicides. That's why we should legalize it, because it would not lower it, but at least it wouldn't make too much of a difference, and at least it would be safe and all those kind of things.
I don't think we know enough about assisted dying and assisted suicide in places where it's illegal for anybody to make any defensible claims about whether, legalization leads to more or less, right? But I haven't been to the local police station lately, but I haven't seen a whole bunch of people lining up to confess to assisted dying, assisting people in dying, right? It's very rarely prosecuted in most parts of the world. So it happens. How often, it's really hard to know. But the other thing I will say about that kind of argument, I mean, it's in the neighborhood or family of slippery slope arguments. And one of the things that, is always worth keeping in mind about a slippery slope argument is that, the argument should only persuade us if we have very compelling reasons to think that, first of all, the slope will materialize. And again, I don't know whether that's really true, as I've been saying. But even if it did, it would have to be clearly and obviously worse than the status quo. Right. And what I feel I always need to say here is, okay, but under the status quo, I think a lot of people die worse than they could have if they had assisted dying available to them. Right.
Right. Yeah.
And so, my opponent, I think, has to say that they think it's tolerable, right, to have a large number of people die far worse deaths than they could have. Which I say, can only say I don't agree with that.
What exactly? Can you clarify what you mean by dying a worse death?
Dying a death that is perhaps passive, meaningless, painful, at odds with the larger values that animated your life. One that is heavily medicalized, where you really don't, experience any of your life other than as a patient, right, rather than like as a just person. A death that or a dying that precludes you from doing a lot of the things that, in the rest of your life were important to you. Traveling, conversing with others, being mobile, enjoying the world, arts, nature, whatever it is that's important to you. I don't have a kind of recipe or formula for what a good death is, but those are the sorts of things that I think people want, right, in their declining days and years. You'll notice that's really, I think, what people want out of the last stages of their lives, right? Not even sort of the dying phase, right? I think that's what people want, when they are aged and elderly, right? Is to, to still be engaged with the world, to still be able to do the things that are important to them, to still have meaningful social relationships, to have, the ability to make choices about their lives, right?
Right.
I think at heart, right, what almost everyone wants is two things that sound contradictory but really aren't, right? My guess is that most people want, on the one hand, for dying to not be entirely discontinuous with the life that came before. Right? So you think about a person who, is very suddenly diagnosed with an extremely aggressive disease, and within a matter of days, after that diagnosis, they go into a hospital. They're there for the rest of their lives. They're hooked up to a lot of technology. They're receiving a lot of drugs, etc. Right? That's a very abrupt, right, transformation in their lives. Right? It makes dying out to be completely discontinuous with what came before.
Right.
All of a sudden, life as you know it comes to a stop, and now you're dying, right? And you're dying in this special place that we put dying people and, other things like that. So I think people don't want that, right? They want, to the degree it's possible for dying to be continuous with the life that came before. Right? Consider, right? Lots of people want to die at home. Why do they want to die at home? Because I think they want their dying to be part of their lives, if that makes sense.
Right.
Right? At the same time, I think they also want them to be acknowledged as dying, right? And to give themselves a chance to be a dying person, right? To acknowledge the fact that their lives are coming to an end, to acknowledge this to others, to do the things that bring, though I hate this term, closure, right? To their lives, right? Sociologists and so forth, talk about the importance of people near the end of their lives occupying the dying role, right? Of their saying and other people saying and acknowledging, yes, you are dying, and this is a special sort of place, right, in your life where you're treated differently and maybe are given, a certain kind of attention that you might otherwise have received.
Privileges.
So,
Sorry, can I ask very briefly why do you consider the term closure to be? Do you dislike the term closure?
It's so hopelessly vague. I mean, it's what everybody wants, but nobody can tell me what it is. So, it's not just the ending of something. It's not just that one's life ends, of course, but I guess it sort of ends in a way that's, I don't know, It doesn't have any loose ends or something like that. I don't know. Sort of long-standing problems have been resolved or addressed or something like that. Though in that case, I'm not sure. I think closure really captures it. I think what people kind of want is to not feel that the end of life had a bunch of missed opportunities in it. Maybe that's what closure is. I don't know.
I guess, yeah, we've always used the term, but it seems to have some side kind of intuitive appeal to it, but I guess I've never really thought about
but it's all hard
the consequences.
It's not just things ending. It's something more than
that. When you were describing like the characteristics of a better death, it seemed to me that from the standpoint of the individual well-being, the argument for an individual wanting to be euthanized, it seems like there's two separate points. One is that you're euthanizing yourself to avoid the immense amount of potential suffering that you are judging to be in the future, and the second one is that by dying before you reach the undesirable state, you are in some sense preserving the dignity of your life. So I guess, for example, my grandfather was like supposedly this very energetic, talkative, in the room guy, and then he had 2 strokes and had an operation and was paralyzed in a wheelchair, and they said was a completely different person, and wasn't. My dad always talks about how he was sad because he wasn't able to live that last 10 years of his life the way he wanted to be and the kind of person he wanted to be. So it's like that kind of argument is avoiding those 10 years, let's say, or that proportion of your life where you're not in tune with the kind of life that you would want to live as a whole, and by euthanizing yourself, or not euthanizing yourself, but choosing to get euthanized, you are preserving the dignity of your life as a whole.
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt that word dignity has very powerful resonances. When we look at sociological work on assisted dying and euthanasia in different parts of the world, many of those who opt for it do invoke exactly that term, right? That they sort of think that their lives are or are becoming undignified. It's a little hard to know what people have in mind when they say that, right? But I think you're right to say that maybe one thing they have in mind is that they want to have their lives be such, and this goes back to something I was saying a moment ago, that they are lived in accordance with how they want to present themselves to the world, or sort of what they want their story of their life to be, right? So, I think a lot of people have strong attachments to certain narratives about their lives, right? Certain sort of story that they want to be able to tell, and they want their experience to vindicate. And for some people, right, perhaps this, is similar to your grandfather's situation, they want the story of their life to be one where it doesn't conclude with a period where what they are and what they think of as the best version of themselves, right, are at odds, right? Mm-hmm. So the end of life can be a period of very heavy dependency on others, very heavy vulnerability, frailty, a sense of being sort of excluded from the world, right, rather than being actively engaged in it, and so on. And so I think for a lot of people, when they worry about dignity, they're sort of worried about ending up in a position that is antithetical, right, to that self-conception or self-narrative that they want their lives to have. Okay. In some ways, I wish, though I understand that dignity has very powerful emotional resonances for a lot of people, I sometimes think that maybe a better word here is something like integrity, right? That I think people want their lives to have a kind of integrity to them. But nevertheless, I think the flip side of that, of course, is that we should be mindful that, sometimes perhaps what people would view as an undignified existence reflects maybe an unreasonable prejudice, right, about their own lives and a kind of disdain for being cared for and being, attended to by others. A lot of people, for example, have a lot of hesitation about, end of life involving, other people being responsible for, cleaning you and hygiene and feeding you and things like this, right? And part of me wants to say, well, I respect the person who doesn't want that, right? On the other hand, I think we should, really kind of ask that person, well, is it really so shameful to be fed or to be cleaned by others? Is it really sort of, worth it,
Right.
to avoid that you want to end your life, right? Is that important enough to you? I mean, if you could have more time with your loved ones, but, somebody would have to feed you, would you really, say no to more time with them? So, I think it's important to respect people's, judgment, respect their autonomy about those kinds of questions, but also to, when we can, sort of really kind of interrogate them about, whether it's the things that they say are so important to their dignity really are at the end of the day that important to them.
I guess so. The only kind of point I can think of that runs counter to, even if you accept that the person does not want to go through, the other people feeding him and cleaning them and doing everything for them, and wants to die in a way with integrity and dignity. The only potential objection I could think of is if, in some sense, if you lived, let's say for 75 years, you've lived this great life, a life exactly how you want it to go. Not exactly, but pretty close to exactly. You feel great about yourself. And then something which you perceive to be traumatic in your life happens. An illness befalls you in some kind of way, and your life changes dramatically, and you're no longer able to live your life in the same way that you did for the first 75 years. I see that in that case, the justification for euthanasia would be, I want to finish, I want to go out with the bang, so to speak. I want to go out the way I want to go out. The only counter that I could see is by choosing not to go through those years after the 75, when the traumatic event happens. In some sense, are you openly admitting or conceding that your life after that will be such a negative or worse, or in such a negative way that you can't even stand it, where perhaps by choosing to end your death, you're giving off the impression that future part of your life would be so bad that you're actually tarnishing the rest of your life, and in a sense you're overestimating how bad that part of your life would be because you're choosing to end it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I think I get the gist of the reasoning there, and I think that there is a deep and difficult dilemma here that I would not purport to be able to resolve satisfactorily. On the one hand, right, I think one thing we might say about the kinds of situations that you're describing are that people would be opting to end their lives in a way that wasn't sufficiently well informed. Right, to go back again to what we were talking about earlier in the conversation about consent, right? So you can imagine a person who's very proud, right, has a very particular sort of conception of themselves and how they want to appear to the world, and they want to be capable and want to be autonomous and these other kinds of things, right? Who says, look, if toward the end of my life I can't, take care of myself in these various ways, I'd really like to have the option of just not living like that at all. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing we might say is, it just seems like you don't know enough about what it would be to live like that.
Right.
right? They're kind of judging it in the absence of enough experience, with this way of life that you think would be, undignified or something like that. That it just doesn't seem reasonable, right, for you to make that choice. Okay. On the other hand, very often we permit people to make choices, quite momentous choices, right, in the absence of knowledge about the alternatives, right? We don't tell people, look, you can only be a practicing Catholic if you've also tried on Judaism for a while or Islam for a while. We don't say to people, how unreasonable of you to practice your preferred religion. You know so little about what it would be like to be, a practitioner of these other things. Or, we don't tell people, look, before you go headlong into a career in engineering, don't you think you should try out, opera singing or something on the off chance that you might prefer that? So, oftentimes we let people make choices in the absence of much evidence regarding the alternatives. But I do feel in this case, there's a lot of weight to the thought that the person is, judging, maybe in a prejudicial way, prejudging, if you will, right? A phase of their life that could be okay, maybe not, the phase of life that they would have expected or wanted, maybe if we'd asked them. But maybe, a period where they're not living in a way that their present self would judge to be dignified might nevertheless be a period of life that it would be worthwhile for them to live through by their own lights, if they could get that far.
And I guess the other question I had, which is about the argument that you're improving your overall well-being by ending your life, by not going through the future, your future, which you judge to entail an immense amount of suffering. The thing that I struggle with is none of us are certain on what death is, right? It's kind of this unknown. I would say, unless somebody's gone there and come back and can tell the rest of the world. But it's it's kind of this question mark of what it is, and the idea that invoking it would cause less suffering, to me is a complicated one, because I can see both sides of the coin. On the one hand, let's say you were, by living, you're going through an immense amount of suffering, and so you're thinking, if death is just nothing, then by killing myself, or by getting euthanasia, I am eliminating the suffering that I would have to go through. On the other hand, one, death, as you said, is going to come one way or another. It's just about timing. And then on the other hand, death is this, relatively unknown path or result of what it is. And so how can you be sure that by entering into death, you are enhancing your overall well-being? Because to me, there's just as much of a chance that it could be tremendous suffering as it could be nothing, or just as much of a chance that it could be, this hedonistic, perfect world.
Mm-hmm. Right. So let me say a couple of things, because you're raising some of the core questions, right, in the philosophy of death and dying, that I think bear on this question of, the justifiability of suicide-assisted dying, what have you. So it's certainly true that, the nature of death is disputed. I don't think it follows that we should think that we don't know anything. And indeed, I would point out that's the whole long tradition of philosophers, religious leaders, others saying that they do think they know what happens. Right? And I think they've got good reason, in support of those claims, right? And of course, those claims vary. Some have held that, we survive death, that there's an afterlife. Others have held that we do not survive death, that there isn't an afterlife. I will say that the little bit of reasoning you gave about, no one having come back to tell us what it's like doesn't strike me as a neutral claim in this debate. It seems to me rather to tell us that there's one hypothesis here that we should take pretty seriously and is probably true, namely that there's nowhere to come back from and we don't survive it. Right? The best explanation of why no one has come back is because, there ain't nothing to return from. It's
Right.
the cessation of our existence. But of course, if there is an afterlife, then the question of whether death is good or bad for you has a lot to do with what the afterlife is going to be like. And there's a whole lot of different views about that. I recently read a very fun book by Ken Jennings, who's the guy who was the Jeopardy champion, but he's recently written a book called 100 Places to Visit Once You Die. And it's basically a kind of tour of all of the different views that different cultures have had as to what the afterlife is like. So there's a lot of different pictures of what it would be like to survive death. But on the supposition that we don't survive death, right, I would say there's kind of two basic positions that philosophers have adopted. One, right, is the position associated with the ancient Epicurean philosophers, which says, well, then, there's a sense in which death is not a factor at all, right, in how well our lives go, because it's a condition of nothingness, right? What will death be like according to the Epicureans? Well, it won't be like anything, right? It's not a state of your existence. And the Epicureans reason, therefore, that there's nothing to be worried or frightened about in connection with that state of non-existence. The other view, and I would say this is probably the more popular view among contemporary philosophers, is what's sometimes called the comparativist or deprivationist view. Right? So to think about the value of death on a comparativist view, we don't ask, well, what will it be like to be dead? Rather, we ask, okay, the significance of death is that it represents the end of our lives. Okay? And our lives can be better or worse depending upon when death happens. So, right, the comparativist says to us that our death is bad for us if, right, when we die, it would have been true that we would have had a longer, better life instead. So notice we don't compare in order to figure out how good or bad death is for us, what it's like to be alive to what it's like to be dead, but rather we compare different lives, right? The life we did get or would get by dying at a certain time versus the life we would get if we lived however much longer we would otherwise have lived. And that, I think, is the position that I'm roughly attracted to, right? It seems to me that when we think about the badness of death, we're not necessarily thinking about how bad it might be to be dead. Maybe there's simply nothing to what it is to be dead. What we're asking, rather, is what is the significance of that event for our lives? If I die at age 80, right, and I would have lived if I hadn't died at age 80 to, let's say, 85, it seems like a credible question to ask, a plausible question to ask. Which one would have been the better life? Right? The one I actually got where I died at 80, or the one I would have had, most likely, if I had made it to 85. If the answer is I would have had a better life, right, by living to 85, then my dying at 80 was bad for me. If, on the other hand, I would have had a worse life by living to 85, then notice that dying at 80 would have been better for me. So the comparativist view says, let's compare different lives. That's the way in which death is significant, right, to our well-being. It's extrinsically significant.
Yeah, that I guess that is quite a good way of thinking about it. Is how does the timing of my death impact the overall quality of my life? Right?
Yeah, in comparison with the life I would have had.
I see.
Right. So this is why, for example, a lot of us, assume, plausibly, that, for a person to die, at a young age, in their teens, say, right, is in many cases going to be worse than dying, in old age, right? Why is that? Well, if they die in their teens, there's a fairly good chance that they were deprived of a much longer and perhaps much better life, right? Because they probably would have lived to 70, 80, 90 years old. If you die in old age, well, then, you might have survived a few years longer. Right? Maybe you lost something, but maybe not something as great a magnitude, right, as the young person does by dying early.
And I guess that also explains why, as you said, traditionally we grieve the death of young people more than we tend to grieve the death of 90, 95 year old people.
Yeah, there's something more lamentable in most cases about the death of the young than about the death of the old. Not always, of course, but at least usually.
I wanted to ask one more question that is kind of on a different note of the previous questions, but it's about the ethics of the person administering the euthanasia, because I do think that can be quite a bearing responsibility of the person who is administering the euthanasia. Is I guess the first question is, in cases where it's legal, is there any regulations in place where, let's say, the person says to their physician, I would like to be euthanized, and I think I read that in a lot of places there's a consent period, so they have to retain that waiting period, so they have to retain that will or position for a certain number of time. And let's say they do that. Is there any, and the physician says, no, I'm not comfortable doing this. Is there any regulations or rules in place where the physician can pass that activity to another physician, like what is the
So let me make a brief comment and then answer what I take to be the heart of the question. So there are parts of the world, of course, where the physician's involvement is quite mediated, right? So in the United States, right, everywhere where assisted dying is legal, the protocol is that the physician writes a prescription that the patient fills, right? And it's the patient that administers the prescription.
Right.
And so in most cases, actually, the law bars the physician from being involved in its administration.
Right. So that's assisted suicide. That's
what people have come to call assisted suicide or assisted dying. Yeah.
Right.
So, but the heart of your question, I think, goes to the role of whoever's providing the assistance. Okay. And places vary throughout the world. I mean, in most places, right, it's going to be the case that those who are actually administering euthanasia are, in fact, medical doctors. Right? This isn't always true. Switzerland is the interesting sort of outlier here.
Right.
Okay. But in those places where it's been legalized, most of them have conscience provisions, right? Physicians are not required to participate in assisted dying or euthanasia if they don't wish to. What you actually see in most parts of the world is it's a relatively small number of clinicians that are involved in most of the cases of assisted dying. A relatively small number that write the prescriptions, administer euthanasia where that's legal and permissible. Okay. And, the reasons for that, I guess, are, probably many, but most prominent, I suppose, is a lot of physicians don't wish to be involved with this, right, for various reasons. Okay. So I would say that most of those that I've encountered or the stories that I've read about those who are involved in the provision of assisted dying, doctors who are involved in its provision, they would take themselves as having a pretty strong duty if they've agreed with a patient, right, on their euthanasia, to follow through if the patient wants to follow through, right? That it would be a kind of breach of care, right, to sort of back out at the last minute. Okay? So I guess that's to say sort of the way that these problems about the involvement of the clinician are handled is first that most clinicians aren't involved. And those who are involved are, maybe a distinct species within the medical profession who think that this is a very important, right, part of providing adequate care to those patients who qualify. I think many of those that I've read about view this as something like a calling or a mission, right, on their part, right, to do this work. And I think they would find themselves, their own conscience would weigh very heavily on them if they didn't follow through on some arrangement with the patient, right, to assist them in dying or to provide euthanasia.
And then what about, so assisted suicide, the physician or whoever gives the patient the means to kill themselves. Is there an argument to be made that is a better way to do it? Because if psychologically, if you want somebody else to do it, it means that in some sense you're not ready to do it yourself, and having somebody else do it makes it easier for you. So you should have to be willing to do it yourself if you're going to do it. Does that make sense?
Well, it's an argument that you encounter. I mean, there are places in the world where both options are available. I think the Netherlands is a place where both of those options are available to you. But most places it tends to sort of be one or the other.
Okay.
I think in terms of arguments for or against, assisted dying versus voluntary euthanasia, okay, those two different kinds of basic models for the administration of the lethal agent. I suppose on the one hand, right, this the assisted dying model, some people would say that this is ethically preferable because in that case, it's really not true that the physician is killing the patient in any sense. They're helping, they're making it possible, they're making it feasible, but they're not actually killing the patient. And if you thought that there is a very kind of bright red line, right, around physicians killing patients, you might then think, okay, assisted dying is preferable to euthanasia. Assisted dying seems to also maybe make it possible for people to end their lives in a wider range of settings and circumstances, right? So most people who use these drugs in states like Oregon, Washington, California, Illinois, Hawaii, the places where it's legal in the United States, they tend to administer them at home, right, with their family members around, right, as opposed to being in a hospital, right, because, if a doctor is going to administer an injection to someone, that's something that needs to take place in a clinical setting, right? It's a kind of medical procedure, right? So that might contribute for some people, right, to a way of dying that they think is better, right, to die in familiar circumstances, etc. There is, on the hand, the other argument, right, that some people may not be able to engage in assisted dying, right? Like their physical conditions may be so depleted, right, that assisted dying isn't something that they can do, right? And there have been some court cases in some jurisdictions where people have said that laws permitting assisted dying actually discriminate against them because it sort of bars them from having access to the same right that people
that
who
makes
are
a lot of sense.
Administer the drug are able to administer. So I think there are pros and cons on each side.
Yeah. William, do you have any more questions before we briefly turn to talking about death and how Dr. Cholbi got into the philosophy of death and dying more generally?
Yeah. So clearly we've gone a bit far on the time, and we didn't have much time to talk about the normative ethics element of euthanasia. So if it's possible, I did want to touch on that a little bit. So as I mentioned before, you have more of a Kantian leaning, and so obviously from my background with euthanasia is just reading Peter Singer, so I'm much more familiar with the utilitarianism justifications for euthanasia. They seem quite straightforward. So what are the Kantian justifications instead for euthanasia? Because obviously Kant himself was against suicide, wasn't he? With the humanity formula, you're treating yourself as a means to an end and not an end itself.
Right. So I think it is important to distinguish between his position and positions that are inspired by Kant. I'm actually somewhat sympathetic to Kant's view that many suicides are violations of duties to oneself, though that doesn't entail that others are entitled to stop you, right? Which I think is an important element of the conversation.
Okay.
I think most philosophers whose support for assisted dying or for the permissibility of assisted dying has a Kantian pedigree are going to appeal to the idea, I suppose, more sort of a Kantian political ideal, right? That each of us should have the right to make the most momentous decisions regarding our lives according to our own judgments, right? They're likely to see in Kant the basis of a kind of anti-paternalistic argument, right, for permitting assisted dying, right? That we're rational agents, that we should have the right to make important decisions about our lives without, interference from other people. And since, the timing and circumstances of your death seems to be one of those very important decisions, right? Others need to have really forceful, right, compelling reasons, right, to prevent us from doing that. And furthermore, right, if we have a desire, right, to end our lives, that serves our ends, right, to end our lives before they would otherwise end, we have the right to seek assistance from other people, right, in doing that, right, that other people can be willing abettors, right, of our pursuing our morally permissible ends, right. So the case for assisted dying would be that I have a right, right, to end my life under the terms that seem reasonable to me, and there need to be very strong reasons for people to stop me from doing that, and furthermore, you have the right to assist me in doing that. That said, I think Kantians have some of the reservations that we were talking about earlier regarding consent, right? Kantians think, that rational consent is going to be very important here, and they're going to ask a lot of questions, right? And probably have to really wrestle with some really tough questions about what would count as sufficient and informed consent, right, to hastening one's own death.
So do you think the argument with the right establishes the morality of the action as well? Because, oftentimes, it's good to distinguish between the two. It's all well and good having the right to something, but does that also establish whether you should or shouldn't do it?
Well, I think that what the sort of Kantian position that I think probably makes the most sense and is the most coherent overall is going to say, first, that in many cases you may well be wronging yourself by ending your life, but that you have, if you will, from the standpoint of interpersonal morality, a moral right to make those kinds of choices. Right? You have the right to make choices that others might think are very imprudent. Right? Again, that kind of anti-paternalistic vibe, right, that I think is present in a lot of Kant's thought. And that others have the right to help you pursue your ends, including, if it is true, dying, right, prematurely, right, if that would serve your ends. So I think that the case for, if you will, the legal permissibility, right, would for the Kantian rest on the moral right, the interpersonal moral right, to make these determinations for ourselves. So, I think that would probably be the gist of the most worked out, right, kind of Kantian position that I think you could advance.
Yeah, I'm just having a little bit of trouble with the if there does the moral right just imply that you should do it as well, or is it just sort of giving you the option to do it? Or
I think it's
would a Kantian just be neutral on the if you should or shouldn't do it?
Well, I mean, I think the Kantian can help themselves to whatever view, right, regarding the nature of well-being or prudence they think is reasonable, right? So Kantianism, I think, can be allied with, any number of views regarding sort of the nature of prudence or well-being. You could be a kind of hedonist about well-being. You could be, a desire fulfillment theorist. You could have any number of accounts of what you think well-being is. I think the Kantian answer then is just as to whether or not you ought to, right? Where that ought is a prudential ought rather than a moral ought, right? Just going to depend upon what they think, well-being amounts to, right? But I tend to think, right, that the Kantian view regarding the interpersonal dimensions of a question like suicide and assisted dying are going to be rest very heavily, right, on the thought that we defer to other rational agents to make the choices regarding their lives that they think are best, and that's a way of respecting them as rational agents, is to let them make those choices, even if they're the choices that we ourselves would not make for ourselves, or even if we think that those are the choices that those individuals ought not make for themselves, potentially speaking. Right? I think the Kantian's got to be very much wedded to the idea that people have a right to make mistakes with their lives.
Okay, that's interesting, to be fair. Usually, at least with the more utilitarian approaches, you get a lot more hardline kind of answers. It's like yes or no in this situation. You should do this, should not. So I think it's certainly interesting to get this. This
I don't know. I mean, the utilitarian view actually is complicated, right? I mean, you and I were, we were talking earlier in this conversation about, the impact of continuing to live versus ending one's life on other people, right? I think it's important to keep in mind that the utilitarian is not going to suddenly become a kind of rational egoist, right, on this particular issue, right? So they're going to have to say, right, that the well-being of others is at play in this decision too. That you're ending your life, say, right, might be better for you, is for the utilitarian only one data point, since of course we think we have to think about all of the parties that might be affected. So.
William, do you have more, or should we turn to the final part?
Yeah, I guess we should go to the final part, given the time and I suppose.
All right, Dr. Cholbi, I wanted to just ask you briefly because about the importance of the philosophy of death and dying, because in some sense, like for me, death was my entry point into philosophy. A personal death led me to, the myth of Sisyphus, which then led me to the Phaedo, and that was kind of my introduction to philosophy through thinking about death and the questions that really concerned me, or that I was thinking about was fear of death. And you're somebody that's devoted a lot of time to studying, writing about, thinking about the philosophy of death and dying. And I'm just curious, from a personal standpoint, how did you get involved? How did you get interested into this particular subject?
Well, I guess there are kind of two streams to that story. So the first stream is that when I was a PhD student, I was in a seminar on Kant's ethics. And as with any seminar, you're required to submit a paper. And I was trying to figure out, what I wanted to write on for the seminar. And I approached the instructor and asked, whether he thought there were any particularly good articles that he would recommend on Kant's views on the ethics of suicide. And he mentioned a couple, but he sort of said to me, this is an area where people have really not said a lot, and what has been said seems kind of unsatisfactory. So I ended up writing the seminar paper, right, on Kant's views on suicide. And that seminar paper ended up being my first professional publication, actually, in philosophy. And that in turn kind of launched me into a general interest in some of the things I was just talking about in response to William a moment ago, sort of how Kantian should think about, this issue. And I wrote some other articles on just that subject. And then about 18 years ago now that I think about it, I was teaching in California, and one of my colleagues was going on sabbatical. And we had in that department a course on the philosophy of death and dying called Confrontations with the Reaper. And the chair of the department came to me and said, we'd really like to be able to offer this course. This is the person who normally teaches it. Would you like to have a crack at it and see if you liked it? And so I did. And I found it to be a very gratifying thing to teach. And I think I've taught it, almost every year for the past, 16, 17 years, something. And I guess to me, it's a very intriguing area of philosophy. I mean, of course, there's a lot of questions in philosophy of death and dying that I suppose you could call sort of ethical questions about, kind of the axiological significance of death. Is it good or bad for us? What circumstances? Plenty of moral questions about death. Questions not only about our own deaths, but, questions about, how we should think about other people's mortality or react to other people's mortality. Questions about the survivability of death, whether immortality is possible. And so I think it's an area of philosophy that is very rich in the sense that you can think about normative questions, but you can also think about metaphysical questions. There are questions in philosophy of medicine, like what counts as somebody being dead? When should we declare a person dead? Questions about, like posthumous harms and interests. Do the dead have interests or rights? Really interesting questions recently in, philosophy of technology. People are developing these avatars, posthumous avatars of dead people using their text messages and, social media posts. And, should we think that's a good idea to have these kinds of liminal figures in our midst, these sort of, dead subjectivities, that we can, look at on our phones. So it's a really rich and fascinating area of philosophy. And then I guess the last thing, I think it's important that people engage, right, and confront their own mortality. I don't think it's good for people to be preoccupied with it, but it's probably a good thing for people to, from time to time, consider the place of this fact in their existence. And I think when you look back to, ancient philosophy in particular, I think it was viewed as a pivotal question, right, for philosophers. How should we relate to mortality? Right, it's one of these sort of practical life advice kinds of questions. Alongside questions about friendship and that kind of thing. What is the place of death in life? It seems to me that a mature and sensible person should want to have a view on that, right? That's not naive or obviously poorly thought through, right? And so in my teaching and my research, I guess I think of myself as trying to help people do that, right? Not in a way that's meant to be dogmatic or proselytizing, right? But from the view that there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be appreciated by coming to have some thoughtful views, right, about the place of death in the human experience. I also like to think it's one of the things that can make philosophy a source of a kind of solidarity, right? Because one thing I like about teaching in particular is that whenever the students show up in my classroom every year, they know that they have this much in common. And so this is not just James's problem or Sarah's problem or Diego's problem. It's kind of all of our problems, right? So there's something to be gained by engaging with it together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this subject is actually very good for, I'm sure as any philosophy practitioner will say, we've probably all received the criticism of, philosophy is just useless thought. You're thinking up stuff that doesn't matter at all. And, I think ethics and specifically this works very well against that sort of argument, even if you don't buy in with the premise, of course, that everything has to be useful.
And of course, I think it's a truism, right, that most people carry around philosophical convictions in their heads, right?
Yeah.
This is an area where undoubtedly people carry philosophical convictions. So they've got opinions, they've got feelings about it. death and what happens and what importance it's got. And so, it would only make sense for us to want to bring those to the surface and see if they make sense.
I think this is a good place to kind of wrap it up. We're nearing the 2-hour mark.
Oh yeah, so we are.
But
an hour and 50 minutes. That's an Edinburgh seminar. So there you go.
It's true.
We got a free seminar.
Yeah. Well, the majority of our audience is Edinburgh students, so there you go. This is what's it called? Classes in the summer classes.
There you go.
Summer classes. Well, look, I want to just thank you both so much for agreeing to do this. This is an issue that I'm very interested in, and this was a fascinating discussion. And Dr. Cholbi,
keep an eye out. There's legislation being very actively considered in Scotland, right, to legalize assisted dying. So it's something to have on your radar.
So it's
voted upon probably at the end of this year, beginning of next. So
it's just Scotland specifically, or the UK?
Yeah, Scottish Parliament. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there you go. This is maybe some people in Parliament will listen to this and think.
I never know. So.
we consider my position. Yeah, but anyway, like I said, this was quite the honor, and thank you guys so much for doing this.
Yeah, well, thank you, Michael, of course.
Glad you've done it. No problem.
This was quite the pleasure. And Dr. Cholbi, if you have any upcoming projects or books that you just want to tell people about, you can feel free to do so.
Oh, no, I don't know. I mean, I'm always writing on these things. I guess the major contribution to look for in the next year or two is that I'm co-editing a Oxford Handbook on the Philosophy of Suicide, which will come out, I would guess, in about a year. But it will have 35 chapters in it, looking at suicide from many, many different philosophical angles, looking at it through different intellectual traditions, Western traditions, but also Asian, Islamic traditions, looking at suicide's rationality, its ethical defensibility, looking at suicide prevention, ethics of suicide prevention, ethical questions about media coverage of suicides. So it will be, I think, a really broad, investigation of this topic, which has been, I think, despite it's being a very old topic in philosophy, is still a little bit neglected. So,
well,
should see that in a year.
I look forward to that, and I should admit, I read your Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on suicide, which was very engaging and a great introduction.
Holy got a goodie, yeah.
to so you've kind of graduated from Stanford to Oxford now.
Something like that, yeah. Yeah.
But I look forward to that.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Once again, thank you guys so much.
Sure.
Really appreciate it, and listeners, hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you guys the next time. So thank you. Hey folks, thanks so much for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, please remember to hit the subscribe button to see all our latest content and stay up to date on new videos. Thank you.